Hindsight is 2020. Generally, when thinking about mistakes we have made in our lives, it's obvious to us where things went wrong. Decisions that once seemed like a good idea or a better choice at the time now seem like obvious mistakes. Emails asking you to send over your bank account information because you had won $1 million now read as clear scams, and people you once put your trust into now appear to be full of malice and ill intent, obviously using every private piece of information you gave them against you. It's incredibly easy to look back on your life and see all the mistakes and warning signs that you had previously missed, paths not taken and relationships not pursued. And that is exactly true in today's case. Welcome back to another episode of Dreading. Today we are going to be talking about the case of Martin Bryant, which was requested by Grant Leonard and Jamie Smithlington. This video, like the majority of our backlog, has been copyright claimed due to our use of certain news footage, meaning that I cannot earn money off of it, and any ad placed on the video goes directly to the third party who claimed it. Luckily enough though, we were able to obtain a sponsor for this video. This video is brought to you by Babbel. In starting this channel, I wanted to be able to cover cases that were less likely to be talked about. I very quickly realized I was at a disadvantage, as I could only talk about stories that I could understand. Any story that wasn't reported on in Western media immediately became inaccessible to me, and that's a huge portion of the world that I remain closed off to. There's only so much that Google Translate can do, and when it comes time to reporting on crimes, a lot is lost in direct translation. But in this line of reporting, you can't afford to lose details or context. However, that issue is being solved with the help of Babbel. For those of you who are unaware, Babbel is a language learning app that teaches you using real-world practical applications, which allows your mind to process and learn the information quicker. It has quick, 10-minute interactive lessons that leave you smarter in a shorter amount of time, and its award-winning technology has been shown to get users speaking a new language in just 3 weeks' time. As someone who struggles with dyslexia and has a hard time learning through strictly written media, I found that their variety of lessons allowed me to pick up an avenue of learning that worked best with me, as I could choose videos, games, podcasts, and more. Being able to hear the words I am learning in real time with context gives them more weight and helps me latch on to learning in a new way that I wasn't able to when I've tried to learn other languages in the past. Through using Babbel, I've been able to start researching cases that have only been covered in Russian media, and likewise will be able to bring attention to those cases as well. There are so many interesting cases that have been covered in Russia, but Western media has only covered a small portion of it, so if I wanted to talk about certain cases, I would be vastly limited. I also plan on learning other languages, so I can give the same respect to every other case that I cover, not just the English-speaking ones. If you're looking to broaden your horizons, or just looking to impress those around you, I would highly recommend Babbel for learning a new language.
К,
Ka?
М,
M?
Т,
Der.
кто.
Kto. Luckily, they have partnered with my channel to give Dreading listeners 65% off by using my link in the description box down below. That is 65% off just by using the link down below. They also have a 20-day money-back guarantee, meaning if you, for whatever reason, don't like their service, you can get a full refund, making it a risk-free investment in your own future. Again, I cannot recommend Babbel enough, and I cannot thank them enough for partnering with me on my channel. With that said, let us begin. Martin Bryant was never a typical kid. In reality, his entire upbringing was littered with ominous warning signs and concerns that, in retrospect, obviously foreshadowed his future, despite the fact that no one seemed to notice. Martin was born in Hobart, Tasmania, on May 7, 1967. He was the first son of Maurice and Carleen Bryant, who would go on to have one more child, a little girl named Lindy. Martin struggled to communicate with the world around him from the minute he was born, yet no one seemed to care about his obvious struggle for his first year of his life. Despite apparent evidence that he had difficulty with connection and socializing with others, Carleen adored how laid back he was as a baby. She would go on to talk about what a blissful baby boy he was, never crying for attention or touch. In fact, he seemed repelled by it, never learning to breastfeed and actually appearing to get upset if he was held. While other mothers would have been worried about their child's lack of attachment to them, Carleen appeared to prefer it, retrospectively talking about Martin's first year of life as being nothing but joyful. It wouldn't be until he was nearly a year and a half old when Carleen began to notice that her son had a penchant for escaping her care and didn't appear to like her, which was equal parts dangerous and terrifying. Carlene began to feel as if her son specifically didn't like her, but enjoyed others, and his continued attempts to distance himself from her was a sign of that. When she was left alone with him, she felt as if he wanted his way out to try and get away from her, and once climbed out of a window and ran into a field when she had gone to get him water. She became increasingly stressed taking care of him, feeling as if she couldn't take her eyes off of him lest something terrible happened. Going to the bathroom, blowing her nose, or taking a phone call became impossible, because it seemed the moment Martin sensed she had gotten the slightest bit distracted, he would bolt, hiding for hours on end as she tried in vain to find him. It drove her mad. His continued running away became such a concern for Carlene that she eventually elected to put Martin on a leash on their porch, chaining him up like a dog. She truly felt as if this was the only way to make sure he didn't run away from her, and by that time, she no longer cared about the social and societal implications of putting her kid on a leash. Every day, she would put a makeshift harness on Martin and attach it to their porch, taking special care that the leash was tight enough that he wouldn't be able to take it off. She then would place his toys on the porch, so he'd have some form of entertainment. She often sat on the porch with him, still feeling as though she couldn't really take her eyes off of him for too long. The harness, she believed, was the only thing that allowed her to go to the bathroom and shut her eyes for more than 2 seconds when she was his primary caretaker. But it wasn't the permanent stress relief she had hoped it would be. On at least one occasion, one of their neighbors had complained to the police, citing that the Bryants had their son chained up like a dog outside of their home. But after a brief visit in which Carlene explained their situation, the cops found there was no child abuse taking place and left them to their own unique parenting method. Maurice, for his part, thought that Martin was just a bit difficult and would eventually grow out of it. He did what he could to placate his wife, often telling her that everything was fine. Martin loved her, and he'd mature past whatever phase this was. Martin was just a bit rowdy, he would say. He also took special care to try and connect with Martin in ways that Carlene wouldn't. He would allow Martin to talk about whatever he wanted for hours uninterrupted, supported all his passions, and basically became Martin's only real friend. At first, a lot of Martin's behaviors were written off as just him being a finicky child. However, as he approached his 3rd birthday, it became clear that something was truly, madly, deeply wrong with him. He was not developing the same way other children in the area were, and it became more and more obvious that cognitively he was struggling. Martin also began purposely irritating others around him, making it a point to cause others mild inconveniences and slight harms. Whether or not this was malicious is unknown, as he seemed to be under the impression that everything he was doing was in good fun, but it appeared to everyone that Martin just enjoyed being a bother. On one occasion, he chopped down his neighbor's trees simply because he could. On another occasion, he broke all of his toys, leaving them on the ground for his mother to step on in hopes she would injure herself. In Carlene's own words, Martin was a frustrating and annoying child. At school, Martin didn't seem to fare any better. He often made the other kids uncomfortable, and at times seemed to relish in causing them grief. Reports would state that Martin was bullied and ostracized by his classmates. However, those same classmates would go on to say that he was always the aggressor, often jumping on them and screaming into their ears. Martin, for what it's worth, would admit to doing this, thinking it was fun and a great way to make friends. When they would recoil and get upset with him, he would begin to scream and cry, stating that they had hurt him in some way when it inevitably gained the teacher's attention. It was a chicken or the egg scenario. Martin would claim that he was bullied and picked on by others for being strange, but the other kids would state that he would purposely jump on them and attack them, which caused them to fear and ostracize him. Which one came first, we will never truly know. To his peers, Martin came across as a bully, and teachers felt as if he was purposely being antagonistic. Eventually, the Bryant family took Martin to a psychiatrist, who almost immediately realized that something was, in his words, fundamentally wrong with Martin. He went further to state that Martin would never be able to hold down a job or be a part of a successful, healthy relationship, simply because he would aggravate people to such an extent that he would always be in trouble. The psychiatrist stated that talking to Martin was like pulling teeth, given that Martin would constantly get distracted and change the subject. When asked questions about his life, Martin instead focused on the various objects and decor in the man's office, going off on unrelated tangents while the psychiatrist hopelessly attempted to get him back on focus. His statements at the end were more indicative of his own frustration with the boy and less how he could be helped, which he heavily implied he couldn't be. Martin's distractibility was due in part to his struggles with ADHD, but he would go undiagnosed for the majority of his life. As Martin got older, his behavior only worsened, with him becoming outright abusive to his sister and her friends. His mother talked about how on various occasions, Lindy would have some of her peers over to hang out, only for Martin to take offense with their presence. He would scream at them to the point where most of her friends refused to come back, scared of what he might do. For her part, Carlene hand-waved this action as just being something that all young boys do to their sisters in some way. But once again, friends of Lindy would go on to talk about how genuinely afraid of him they were. Teachers described him at this point as distant from reality and completely void of emotion. Gaining his attention was nearly impossible, and he refused to interact with others in a way that most would deem socially acceptable. It was a struggle to gain his attention, but most found that they didn't want to have it in the first place. He also around this time began to torture and kill animals, doing so at school and in front of other children. At the same time, Maurice, looking to bond with his son, bought him an air rifle. He had hoped that they would connect over shooting clay pigeons. However, Martin didn't care for that in the slightest. Instead, Martin would hide in the bushes along the stretch of the road by his house and shoot at passing cars. He would also use the gun to kill animals, shooting parrots off of the neighbor's tree, and then continuing to shoot them as they lay dying on the ground. Maurice would later say that buying the air rifle was a mistake and one of his biggest parenting regrets, but his violent tendencies were not simply isolated to when he used his air rifle. On at least one instance, Martin tried to cause real harm to another student at school in a way that could have easily led to their death. The boy was a year younger than Martin and had been swimming, when Martin, for reasons unknown, pushed the boy further down in the water and took away his snorkel, clearly trying to drown him. Luckily, the boy was able to get away, but it was clear that he had wanted to cause real, lasting harm. Because of that, he was suspended from school for 1 year's time. The next year, he was allowed back at school and apparently showed signs of improving behavior in his class, but was still bullying younger students. Most were afraid of him, as he seemed cold and only seemed to be happy when he was causing injury to others around him. When he eventually graduated and went to high school, he was placed in the special education unit, where his grades and behavior would deteriorate rapidly. Maurice tried his best to help his son. He knew that Martin meant well, but simply had a harder time communicating his thoughts and feelings, so he worked hard to make things easier on him. Carlene took a more hands-off approach, finding it hard to relate to her son, but ultimately wanting the best for him. Martin and Carlene still had a mostly strained relationship, as it seemed as if they hadn't been able to appropriately bond when he was a child. In 1983, when Martin left school, he was assessed for a disability pension, with a general understanding from those around him that he would be unable to hold a job or support himself. His parents pointed to the first psychiatrist assessment of Martin when he was in middle school, where he stated Martin would never be able to hold down any job. He met with another psychiatrist, this one more equipped to assess Martin's behavior and eccentricities. In his assessment of Bryant, he wrote that he, quote, cannot read or write, does a bit of gardening and watches TV. Only his parents' efforts prevent further deterioration. Could be schizophrenic and his parents face a bleak future with him. The assessment made it clear that Bryant would be in no way able to take care of himself in the long term, and any hopes the Bryants had of him moving out or taking care of himself were gone. It would later be determined that Bryant had a shockingly small IQ of 66 and was borderline mentally disabled. According to experts, he had the mind of an 11-year-old, trapped in the body of a grown man. After graduating high school, Maurice encouraged Martin to at least try to interact with the world. He knew his son had a penchant for gardening, so he pitched the idea to Martin that he should try to have his own lawn care business. Maurice would pay Martin to take care of their lawn once a week, and he would help Martin recruit new clients in the neighborhood. It was Maurice's hope that while Martin would never be able to move out and live on his own, that they could give him the tools he would need to be a better, functioning member of society. He worried about what would happen to Martin when he and Carlene could no longer take care of him. It was through this lawn care service that Martin met Helen Mary Elizabeth Harvey, the heiress to the Tattersall's lottery fortune. Helen, like Martin, seemed to be mentally impaired, but unlike Martin, was incredibly friendly to those she had to interact with. Most knew her to be incredibly reclusive and a bit of a shut-in, and her stately mansion that she inhabited with her mother had fallen into an intense state of disrepair. Martin had gone over to the home and offered his services to Harvey, which she readily accepted. Martin became a regular fixture at the home, taking care of the lawn as well as the animals that roamed on the property, which included 14 dogs and over 40 cats. Over time, Martin and Helen became friends, finding a sense of understanding in the other that they didn't get from the outside world. Though Helen was kind and rich, she rarely bathed and often wore clothing that was caked in filth. The animals that had roamed free of her house caused her to smell like manure, and there were times when shop owners would ask her to leave their establishments because it would appear that she had excrement on her. Her hair was often matted, and taking care of herself and her ailing mother appeared to be too much for her. But Martin didn't judge her the way others did. In fact, his own issues seemed to make her feel more or less normal. Martin and Helen began to go out together, and over the next 3 years, they would be seen out and about, going to fancy dinners and buying expensive items that would mostly go unused for the estate, which was still in a dangerous state of disrepair. Martin eventually moved out of his parents' home and into Helen's, which was a feat that no former psychiatrist had thought possible. At the same time, when Martin moved in with Helen, he began sleeping with a live pig in his bed. Why he did this would later become clear, but it was said that because of this, Martin's bed was regularly soiled, and he likewise would smell of pig excrement. The relationship with Martin had come at a cost, though. Helen began to neglect her mother, Hilza, who remained bedbound, with untreated leg ulcers and a hip that had been broken for no less than 2 years. Prior to meeting Martin, Helen had been doing a decent job of taking care of her mother, although it was nowhere near the level of care she needed. But with the addition of Martin in the home, Helen had all but forgotten her mother, and would leave her unattended for days at a time. In June of 1990, 3 years after Martin and Helen had met, someone reported the home and its condition to health authorities, and what they found was a horror show. The entire first floor of the home had been overrun by dogs, and there was feces everywhere. The garage belonged to feral cats, and the stench of cat piss hung heavy in the air. There was mold growing in the kitchen and the bathrooms, and the walls were covered in excrement and dirt. And the health inspectors were shocked at the absolute squalor the three chose to live in despite having millions to their name. On the second floor, they found Hilza in her bed, covered in her own urine and feces, with open leg sores festering. Helen was also there, and it was found that she too had untreated leg ulcers that she simply didn't notice. Both women were taken to the hospital for their medical issues, and Hilza would unfortunately pass away a few weeks later. While they were in the hospital, a cleanup order was put on the home, as it was deemed unhospitable. Maurice and Martin helped with the cleanup. However, after Helen was released from the hospital, it was relayed to her that she wasn't allowed to have any more animals on the property. She decided she no longer wanted to live at the mansion. Despite Martin's own proclivity towards hurting animals, Helen adored them, and she didn't want to live in her home without them. Ultimately, Martin and her decided to move onto a 72-acre farm called Tarrisville, 45 minutes away in the small town of Copping. Before moving, Bryant was once again assessed by a psychiatrist for his disability pension, who reported that, quote, Martin's father protects him for any occasion which might upset him, as he continually threatens violence. Martin tells me he would likely go around shooting people. It would be unsafe to allow Martin out of his parents' control. Unbeknownst to the psychiatrist, Martin wouldn't be in his parents' control, as Maurice and Carlene would not be joining Martin in Copping, which would be a deadly oversight. Once Helen and Martin moved to Tarrisville, Martin took it upon himself to police the city in his own way. Neighbors would often see him carrying his air gun that his father had given him years back while walking around, and he would fire it at tourists. He would shoot at people he thought didn't belong, or who were infiltrating the area. And though he would try in earnest to make friends, most avoided him at all costs. Bryant and Harvey filled their large farm with animals, and were often seen corralling more when they went into town. Their cars were known to always have at least 3 animals in the back seat, whether that be cats, dogs, or even mini horses. Martin's odd behavior wasn't simply limited to the people of Copping. He was also seen shooting at dogs and sheep that lived on the property, once again taking his anger and frustration out on animals who couldn't defend themselves. He also began to do things that would endanger Helen's life. After the death of her mother, Helen had placed Martin as being the sole beneficiary of her will, leaving him more than 550,000 Australian dollars. If she were to pass, he would be the owner of the 72-acre farm, and all of her property, and everything that the pair had bought together, including 30 cars. After being placed in the will, every time that the pair were in the car together, Martin would grab the steering wheel from Helen and try to veer the car off the road. Helen had complained about Martin doing this on at least 3 occasions to others, and at least one other person had been in the car when Martin had attempted this before. Helen was an incredibly cautious driver, deliberately never going over 37 miles per hour, and she found this new habit of Martin's terrifying. He had already caused 3 accidents, and though they hadn't been too serious, she was fearful of her and her animal's safety. She would ask him not to sit in the front seat anymore, scared about if he would take the wheel. But Martin would never listen. Martin, for his part, would state he was just being funny and didn't mean anything by it. He wasn't actually trying to cause harm. It was just a bit of a laugh. But it worried most around Helen. Some felt that Martin, having already secured his place in her will, was trying to kill her so he could have access to her fortune. And whether or not that was true or not, on October 20th, 1992, Helen would in fact perish in an automobile accident while Martin had been in the car. According to the accident report, Helen and Martin had been driving when, seemingly out of nowhere, Helen veered the car directly into oncoming traffic. Helen had been killed instantly, and Martin had been taken to the hospital with severe back and neck injuries. There had been 3 dogs in the car as well, 2 of which died, while the third was unharmed. According to Martin, who was the only survivor of the crash, 2 of the dogs began to fight in the back seat, and Helen had uncharacteristically turned her body around to try and stop them, taking her hands completely off the wheel. The car then veered into the other side of the road, colliding with another car. The police lightly investigated the crash, but determined that there were no signs of foul play, despite the fact that it was known that Martin enjoyed grabbing the wheel and veering the car the way that had been done before. There was no direct evidence showing that that had been the case. They also stated that the crime lacked motive, as Bryant had only the quote-unquote vaguest notions as it pertained to money, and was too incompetent to kill for profit. The case closed quickly, with Helen's death being labeled as a tragic accident, and all of her property and money being given to Martin. However, Carlene, knowing her son and his inability to handle such wealth, opted to put the money into a trust, meaning he wouldn't have full access to it. It took 7 months for Martin to fully recover from the crash. All the while, his dad was placed in charge of the copping farm and the various animals there. At the same time, Maurice saw a psychiatrist and had just begun taking antidepressants, as the stress of taking care of Martin was beginning to wane on him. He told the psychiatrist that although he loved his son, he was scared of him and what he would do. He felt entirely responsible for Martin, and every time he had killed an animal, shot a person, or hurt someone else, he felt pressure to do more, but he didn't know if it was helping or hurting him. Maurice was struggling, but he kept his issues to himself, not wanting to burden any of the other family members with his mental health woes. Martin was released into his mother's care after 7 months in the hospital, and he stayed at home with her in order to continue to recuperate. By August 1993, he had fully healed, and was once again living at the farm, only this time without Helen to rein him in. He began to act even more outlandishly, still shooting at people with his air rifle and trying to make friends with people in the town, only to be rejected. Because he was on his own, Maurice made it a habit to go out and visit the farm. He would briefly clean up the farm for Martin, take care of the animals, and make sure everything was in healthy condition, as Martin didn't mind living in total squalor. That had been Maurice's plan when he drove the 45 minutes to the Tarsville farm on August 13th. However, tragedy would strike once more. The next morning, a man Maurice had made plans with came to the property and found a note stuck to the front door that said to call the police. He called the cops at once and tried to find Maurice on the property, but only found Martin, who was incredibly nonchalant. For his part, Martin stated he hadn't seen his father the night before, and didn't seem worried about the note stuck to the door or the odd circumstance regarding his father's disappearance. As the police came to the property to search, he remained in the background, cracking a few jokes and generally seemed at ease. In fact, he tried to hit on one of the female officers who were participating in the search, asking multiple of them out to dinner and stating that he was a millionaire. Early on in the search, the police found Maurice's car, locked in a shed on the property. Inside the car was a suicide note and thousands of dollars in cash. The note gave no direct indication of where he had taken his own life, but the moment it was found, it was clear that they were looking for a body. It wouldn't be until the police called in divers to search the reservoir in the back of the property that Maurice would be found. He had a diving weight wrapped around his body, and he clearly drowned. There were no signs of any assault or attack on his person or the property, but people found the manner of death odd. People at the scene stated that they found the death to be outright unnatural and felt as if there was no way Maurice had done this to himself. People also found it strange that multiple dead animal carcasses were found around Maurice, as if this part of the reservoir was used as a sort of burial ground. Something that is often passed over in this case is the fact that somewhere along the way, Martin's violence towards animals had turned sexual in nature. He had begun collecting pornography that featured graphic scenes of bestiality in it, and it was thought, at least after Helen died, that he began to sexually abuse the animals on the property. He would tell various people, including children, about his sexual interest with animals, but none of them were ever around long enough to witness anything. Whether or not he had been sexually abusing any of the animals was unclear, but it was clear that Martin had, at the very least, taken to killing multiple sheep and floating their bodies in the same spot his dad would later be drowned in. Many believed that, despite Maurice's depression, he hadn't killed himself. Rather, he had been murdered by his son. It was thought that after the death of Helen, he realized that killing people around him would lead to him getting more money. He knew his dad had put him in the will, and he would gain upwards of 250,000 Australian dollars if he died. And so, on a weekend visit, he killed him. Online sleuths have posited that he practiced killing his father on the animals that were found floating in the water around him, showing premeditation. However, based on Martin's disability and the belief that he wouldn't be able to follow through with a plan like that, the death was ultimately ruled a suicide, and Martin inherited the 250,000 Australian dollars. After his father's and Helen's death, Martin had nothing to hold him back. He had more than enough money to support himself for the rest of his life, and he had 2 spacious mansions that he was the sole owner of, so he could do whatever he wanted. Years before, the psychiatrist said that Martin told him that he would like to go around shooting people, and that, in his words, it would be unsafe to allow Martin out of his parents' control, and now he truly was. Newly on his own, he decided he was going to attempt to be more social. Most people knew him to be violent, with him still shooting tourists every time he encountered them. But just like he had in middle school, he misunderstood the reasoning as to why people didn't enjoy being around him. He was under the impression that people didn't like him because of reasons outside of his control, like the fact that he didn't have a lot of money. But now that he did, he dedicated himself to looking the part. What the fuck? This is Dumb and Dumber. Martin replaced his entire wardrobe with bold outfits that he thought indicated wealth. He was often found in colorful suits, large cravats, lizard skin shoes, and an oversized Panama hat. He also carried a large briefcase, and every day he would go into various shops and restaurants, loudly declaring that he was a very important businessman who was in town for business reasons. Many who saw him stated that he appeared to act like a child's idea of what an adult looked like, rather than an actual adult. On one occasion, while wearing a blue suit with bell-bottom pants and a ruffled shirt, he went into a restaurant and told everyone who was there that he was a well-respected, highly paid businessman who was in town to buy property. On the off chance someone would talk back to him, he would give them different stories about how he got his money. His behavior was so odd and off-putting that most people inside the restaurant laughed at him, thinking he was doing a bit, or trying to be funny. The owner would later talk about the experiences as being horrible. He stated that everyone was laughing at him, even the customers. I really felt suddenly quite sorry for him. I realized this guy didn't have any friends. It seemed that after the instance at the restaurant, that Martin came to the conclusion that it wasn't possible for him to make friends in the town of Copping. In fact, he began to feel as though Tasmania, and more so Australia, in its entirety, had it out for him. He felt as if the people didn't understand him, and were actively against him. So he decided he would become a world traveler. Using the money left to him by his father and Helen, he began to travel around the world, visiting various cities, landmarks, and experiencing other cultures. However, he found that he wasn't well regarded in these towns either, and most people would continue to avoid him. People who had interacted with him during this time recall how he would openly speak about his sexual interest in animals, how he had shot over 20 dogs, and how he hated certain people for the way they looked, more specifically, Asian men and women. No one he talked to ever felt safe enough to relay to him that what he was doing was inappropriate and made them uncomfortable. Most of the time, they would simply ignore him and try to walk away. There was one thing about traveling that Martin liked, though, and that was plane rides. Martin found that while on the plane, people could do very little to avoid him. If they wanted to ignore him, they came across as rude. He also found if he spoke loud enough, most couldn't politely pretend he wasn't there, and so they would have to interact with him. Every trip across the globe, Martin looked forward to the plane ride the most, knowing that it would likely be the time that he could talk to the most people. Sometime towards the end of his travels, Bryant became suicidal. The reason as to why has only been speculated by some, with Martin himself giving conflicting reports. He stated that he felt as if the world had turned their back on him, and everyone was against him, and that is why he was alone in the world. He stated that he felt unwanted and uncared for in every sense of the word, and that he wanted to make the world finally recognize who he was. He was going to make the people who turned their back on him pay. Thus, he began to plan out a killing spree that would be one of the deadliest shootings in Australian history. Prior to Maurice's death, he had been interested in purchasing a bed and breakfast called the Seascape. It was a quaint little home that was located next to Port Arthur, and Maurice had been set upon spending his retirement years at the inn, taking care of tourists and basking in the beauty that surrounded it. But before he could get his finances together to put in an official offer on the property, an acquaintance of his bought it up from under him. That person was David Martin. Martin had also planned to spend his years in the property with his wife, Nolene, the same way Maurice did, and ultimately was able to purchase the cottage for himself. While from a third-party perspective, it seemed that the two men had the same goal, and one of them would obviously walk away feeling put out, according to Martin, this was the direct reason for his father's suicide. Martin would go on to state that on numerous occasions, his father brought up David Martin, and how he had stolen the Seascape bed and breakfast from him. Maurice had talked to David in the days leading up to the purchase, and David had never seemed interested in the property at all. He knew that Maurice was putting his finances together, but his purchase of the property, Maurice said, was backhanded. After they had bought the property, Maurice had made an offer to them, but they declined. Once more, they stated that they wanted to use the bed and breakfast and live out their retirement years there, so they rejected every money offer Maurice put together. Martin had heard how upset his father was, and saw how devastated he was to lose the Seascape. He went on to say about the Martins that they were the worst kind of people in his life, and so, when he decided that he was going to go on a murder spree, he opted to start with the people he hated the most, them. On April 28, 1996, Bryant drove his little yellow Volvo to the Seascape bed and breakfast. He had placed his surfboard on top of his car in order to throw off any suspicion as to what was to come. At 11:45, he arrived at the bed and breakfast and immediately removed his newly purchased AR-15 rifle out of his duffel bag and stormed into the property. Martin and Nolene had been having a lovely day together, sprucing up the inn when he entered. Nolene was shot immediately. She died at once, but he continued to shoot the older woman, attacking her as if she were still alive. David heard the gunshots, but had no idea what the sound was. The idea that someone had come into their peaceful seaside inn and opened fire was ludicrous. The sudden onslaught of loud noises alarmed him nevertheless, and he ran to the front in order to make sure his wife was okay. Upon turning the corner into the front entrance to check on her, David was likewise shot, but was still alive. Bryant then gagged David with a rag and then, in a rampage, began to stab him repeatedly. In Martin's mind, he was ridding the world of the most ruthless person he had ever come across, although to others who knew them, Martin and Nolene had been nothing of the sort. After killing David, Martin went to the sink and cleaned off his hands, taking special care that no blood was remaining on his person. He then exited the small inn and locked the door behind him, wanting to come back at the end of his planned attack for a face-off with the police. As he was exiting, two tourists approached him to inquire about spending the night there. Martin rebuffed them rudely, stating that there was no one, save for his own girlfriend, inside the inn, and that they should find other accommodations. To the tourists, Martin came across as equal parts rude and awkward, and they quickly left, not wanting to speak to him any further. Martin got back into his car, backed up towards the inn, and loaded another round of ammunition into it before driving off to his next target, Port Arthur. Port Arthur was the site of a 19th century convict settlement. As it fell into despair over the years, it became a tourist attraction. The site was gorgeous, and due to its historical significance, thousands of people would travel there every year to take in the sights. Because of how popular the site was with tourists, as well as the fact that it was in a remote location, Martin opted to use it as a hunting ground. He arrived at the site at 1:10 p.m. and paid the entry fee in the parking lot. The site security manager tried to guide him to customer parking. However, instead, Martin ignored him, opting to park behind some campers and vans. He then seemed to fiddle with some things in his car, before deciding to move it closer to the Broad Arrow Cafe. After parking for a second time, Martin got out of his car with a large duffel bag containing his guns and a video camera that was already filming. He then entered the cafe, purchased a meal, and like he had so many other times before, tried to engage with the people around him. He commented on the fact that there weren't a lot of WASPs out that day, referring to the term meaning white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, and not the bug. He also stated that there were not as many Japanese tourists out, which he seemed annoyed about. It appeared that these had been the main demographic that he was looking to injure in his attack. However, them not being present did little to dissuade him from taking action. After Martin finished his food, he had been largely ignored by the seated around him. He reached into his duffel bag and pulled out his video camera and set it down on the table. He likewise pulled out the knife he had used on David Martin, which was still caked in his blood. Only then did he pull out his gun and begin shooting, starting with the two people at the table next to him, Mo Yi No and Su Lang Chung. He then began to fire randomly towards everyone he saw. The next person he took aim at was Mike Sargent, who had been visiting Port Arthur with his girlfriend, Kate Scott. Martin shot at Mike and grazed his skull, knocking him down to the ground and causing him to think he had been fatally wounded. While he lay in shock, Kate was likewise struck in the back of her head and died immediately. Jason Winter had been visiting the cafe with his family that morning and decided to help out the staff as they had been swamped with customers. As the shots began to ring out, he saw Martin moving towards his wife Joanne and their newborn son. In an effort to distract Martin from his family, he threw a serving tray at Bryant's head, which struck him dead center. Martin then turned around and shot at him, but missed. His distraction had worked, and his family remained unharmed. Directly after shooting at Jason, he shot and killed 44-year-old Anthony Nightingale, 68-year-old Kevin Sharp, 66-year-old Walter Bennett, and 67-year-old Raymond Sharp. At the same time, he managed to hit Gerald Broom, Gay Fiddler, and her husband, John Fiddler, Tony and Sarah Kiston, Andrew Mills, Thelma Walker, and Pamela Law, but luckily they survived and were able to get out of Martin's line of fire. Bryant continued to move through the cafe, blocking off the exit. However, many visitors outside of the cafe had no idea what was going on and thought there was some form of demonstration or reenactment occurring. Again, the thought that someone was killing people inside the small cafe and gift shop didn't occur to those present, so they began to rush into the cafe and gift shop, trying to see what was going on. This, of course, led to more people being in danger, and though some trying to escape tried to warn them of what was happening, no one seemed to notice. Eventually, someone began yelling fire, which finally caused people to disperse. Bryant continued to move about. He shot Graham Collier in the jaw. He had been sitting with Carolyn Lofton and her daughter Sarah. After Collier had been shot, Sarah attempted to run towards her mother, and Bryant shot at her. Seeing his eyes focus in on her daughter, Carolyn lunged over Sarah to shield her with her body. However, Sarah had been fatally shot in the head. He then shot Mervyn and Mary Howard and Robert Elliott as he moved towards the gift shop. From the point he put his camera down and began shooting, only 15 seconds had gone by, and at that time, he managed to injure a total of 22 people, 12 of which passed away from their injuries. But he was far from finished. Many others took advantage of the opportunity to hide behind tables and behind store displays as Bryant came closer to the gift shop area. Nicole Burgess, 17, was tragically shot in the head, and Elizabeth Howard, 26, was fatally shot in the arm and chest immediately as he entered the shop, signaling phase 3 of his killing spree. Carolee Lever and Vera Jerry huddled behind a screen, trying to hide from Martin. Dennis Lever, Carolee's spouse, was fatally shot in the head as he moved to escape fire. Pauline Masters, Vera J's husband Ron, and Carolyn Nash tried but failed to escape the shooting through a locked emergency exit door. Gwen Neander was likewise shot in the head as she was trying to get to the door. As Martin continued to move through the shop, he shot Peter Crosswell, Jason Winter, Dennis Olson, Ronald Jerry, Peter Nash, and Pauline Masters. Carolyn Nash, who had been hiding next to them, had been able to escape unharmed, using her husband's dead body for cover. In the span of seconds, Martin had taken 8 more lives, bringing his total up to 20 deceased, and wounded another 12. But still, he had more to do. Martin exited the gift shop and cafe and made his way to the parking lot. He began to take fire at whatever caught his eye, shooting at buses and various people as they tried to flee. He was able to kill another 4 people and injure 5 others. He then decided to take his rampage on the road. Getting back into his car, he began to head up the road away from Port Arthur, and it was there he happened upon Nanette McCack and her children. Nanette had fled Port Arthur while carrying her 3-year-old, Madeline, and 6-year-old, Alana. Bryant spotted them and pulled his car up near them, opening his door. Nanette had not witnessed any of his crimes, and didn't know that it was him that had opened fire, and thought he was just trying to help her and her kids. Martin then stepped out of his car with his gun and ordered Nanette on her knees. She pleaded with him as she knelt, but he shot her in the head, and then shot both of her children. Bryant continued down the road until he was stopped by traffic at a toll booth. At the front of the line was a BMW that was occupied by Mary Rose Nixon, Russell James Pollard, and Helene and Robert Salzman. Bryant, wanting to get back to the Seascape Inn in order to finish his plan, got annoyed at the traffic. He exited his car and made his way, weapons in hand, to the BMW. According to witnesses, Bryant got into an argument with Robert, who was seated in the passenger seat of the vehicle, and he shot him at point-blank range. Pollard then got out of the car to confront Bryant, and he likewise shot him in the chest, before reaching into the car and shooting Helene and Mary. Martin then removed their bodies from the back seat and transferred his ammunition and supplies to the BMW, choosing it to carry out the remainder of his plan. He continued up the road to a service station, where he promptly cut off another car that was trying to escape. In the car was Glenn Pierce and his girlfriend Zoe Hall. For some unknown reason, Martin decided that he was going to abduct the pair. This hadn't been part of his original plan, but he felt invincible at this point. He got out of his car and approached Glenn's, rifle in hand. Glenn got out of the car to try and reason with Martin, but Martin told Glenn to get into his stolen BMW and locked him inside. He then went to the passenger side of the car where he noticed that Zoe was trying to climb over the driver's side in order to escape. He then shot her 3 times, before getting back into the BMW and finishing the drive to the Seascape Inn. On the road to the inn, he likewise shot at every car he happened upon. Luckily, he was unable to take any more lives. Once at the Seascape Inn, Martin brought Glenn inside and handcuffed him to the stairs. He then set the BMW on fire. At some point within the next 18 hours, Martin shot Glenn, but it's unknown how or when he truly died. Shortly after arriving, a reporter who had heard about the shooting called the inn, wanting to see if they had any knowledge of what was occurring. She had been calling multiple local establishments with the same hope, but by sheer coincidence was able to get the murderer on the line. She asked him what was happening, to which he responded, "A lot of fun." He then told her if she were to call back, he would kill his hostage, and hung up. It didn't take long for the police to find where Martin was. Because he had chosen the inn, it was unclear as to how many people were inside. The police knew he had taken at least 1 hostage, and because their bodies hadn't yet been found, they believed that David and Olene were still inside, and they wanted to negotiate for their safe return. However, when they were able to contact Martin via phone, he seemed unbothered by the whole situation. Usually, in attacks like what had just occurred, the attacker is in a fragile emotional state and contemplating taking their own life. They are hurt and feel the need to lash out, and will take any opportunity to do so. But Martin was the opposite. He seemed happy, as if nothing had happened at all, and seemed to be enjoying himself. Conversations with a negotiator went nowhere, with Martin never relaying any feasible demands, with the negotiator unable to get a firm grasp on what Martin was after. At 8 a.m. the following morning, smoke began to rise from the Seascape cottage. Martin had set the small inn on fire, hoping to distract the police for long enough that he could make his escape. But he accidentally managed to set himself alight with the house, and 10 minutes after the smoke began to rise, he burst through the front doors and rolled on the wet ground, hoping to quell the flames. While he was rolling on the ground, the police were able to surround him, promptly arresting him and taking him to the Royal Hobart Hospital for his wounds. In the span of minutes, Martin had become one of the most prolific mass murderers in the world, and all because, in his own words, he was tired of people not understanding him. After he was treated for his wounds, the police spent multiple days talking to Martin, trying to get him to understand the gravity of the situation. But each time, Martin both denied responsibility and seemed to take glee from the idea that he was being talked about. Martin stated that he had no idea what had happened, and that the person responsible should be ashamed of themselves. But when he was shown video footage that had been taken by victims of the attack that clearly featured him, he feigned ignorance, saying that they should be looking for that man. However, given his gleeful demeanor and smug attitude, it was clear that he wasn't actually stating his innocence. He was purposely denying responsibility to irritate the people around him. It had been just like his childhood psychiatrist had stated. If he could bother someone, he did, and genuinely derived pleasure from it. The tapes of Martin's interviews have been released in a documentary by 7 News Australia, but their unedited footage has yet to be released. The transcripts are, however, readily available, and upon reading, provide a dizzying look into Martin's mind and how little he cared for the proceedings. At times, he would talk openly about various aspects of his day and what he had done, never quite admitting to the shooting or taking any lives. And then, with a smirk, he would say he made everything up, and had no idea what they were talking about, that what they were claiming he just said was fictitious and lies. He readily admitted to stealing the BMW and setting the Seascape Inn on fire, but everything else was, he claimed, done by somebody else. He was quoted as saying his biggest regret surrounding the day was that he drove without a license, because breaking the law like that is foolish. However, at the end of the last interview between Martin and the detectives, after Martin believed the camera and recording equipment were turned off, he smirks at the detectives and says, "I'm sure you'll find the person who caused this." Then slightly, grinning ear to ear, motions to himself and whispers, "Me." After a beat, he motioned over to the camera, which again, he believed had been shut off at that point, and stated, "You should have put that thing on recording," seemingly gloating about confessing to committing one of the deadliest mass shootings in the world and feigning ignorance about it. It was clear, though, that from the footage alone, that he was more than competent and understood what he was doing, despite his low IQ and lack of basic intelligence. He was basically just putting on a show, hoping to get a lesser charge. His glee was short-lived, as the detectives informed him that the camera was still going, and they had their confession on tape. After he pled guilty at the insistence of his lawyer, Martin was sentenced to 35 life tariffs, with an additional 1,035 years added on for good measure. For the first 8 months of his life sentences, he was placed in a suicide prevention cell in near solitary confinement. After that, he was sent to Hobart's Wilfrid Lopes Center, which was a mental health facility. Because of his treatment, Martin doubled his weight and attempted to take his own life multiple times. He likewise assaulted multiple staff members and patients while in the facility. There is no good way to end this story. Martin is a truly disturbed person who could have easily been stopped. Every psychiatrist who saw him stated he was a danger to society, and that something like this was inevitable if he were to ever leave his parents' care. And still, he was able to move out of their home and into the home of a woman he killed. The fact that he wasn't put immediately into a care facility and instead roamed the countryside, actively shooting people with his air rifle, talking to psychiatrists about wanting to cause real, tangible harm to others, and no one thought anything of it, is ridiculous. Warning signs were obvious, but because everyone chose to ignore them, 35 people were killed, senselessly, including Winifred Joyce Applin, 58, Walter John Bennett, 66, Nicole Louise Burgess, 17, Sue Lang Chung, 32, Elva Rhonda Gaylord, 48, Zoe Ann Hall, 28, Elizabeth Jane Howard, 26, Mary Elizabeth Howard, 57, Mervyn John Howard, 55, Ronald Noel Jerry, 71, Tony Videvalu Kiston, 51, Leslie Dennis Lever, 53, Sarah Kate Lofton, 15, David Martin, 72, Nolene Sally Joyce Martin, 69, Pauline Virginia Masters, 49, Alana Louise Meekick, 6, Madeline Grace Meekick, 3, Nanette Patricia Meekick, 36, Andrew Bruce Mills, 39, Peter Brenton Nash, 32, Gwenda Joanne Neander, 67, William Zhang No, 48, Anthony Nightingale, 44, Mary Rose Nixon, 60, Glenn Roy Pierce, 35, Russell James Pollard, 72, Jeanette Kathleen Quinn, 50, Helene Maria Salzman, 50, Robert Graham Salzman, 57, Kate Elizabeth Scott, 21, Kevin Vincent Sharp, 68, Raymond John Sharp, 67, Royce William Thompson, 59, and Jason Bernard Winter, 29. All the people mentioned above had lives left to live. They all deserved to be here today, pursuing their interests, traveling, and simply doing what they loved. But instead, Martin killed them, because he wanted people to pay for not finding him talking about his animal fetish entertaining. Thank you for watching today's episode of Dreading, and thank you even more to the subscribers who suggested I look into this case. This was heartbreaking to research, but I think the world is better off knowing what happened here. If you have a case suggestion, please feel free to leave it in the comments down below or send it via email. And thank you to Babbel for sponsoring this video. Remember, stay safe.